Everyone, please welcome Damon Runberg to the main stage. He's our state Central Oregon economist, and we're proud to have him this morning.
Thanks, Katie. I don't really need much introduction. I think most of you have seen me before, and in fact, I prefer less introduction, too. I'm the local guy here, although Josh recently moved to Central Oregon, so now he's a local guy, too. Happy Halloween, everyone. Pleasure to see you. I don't see a lot of costumes out there. I'm a little disappointed, right? Nobody? I wore my costume. I don't know if anyone, this is the first time in 8 years of living in Central Oregon I've ever worn a tie in Central Oregon. Also the first time I ever wore a bow tie, so I felt like normally as an economist, sort of our occupational dress code, I always wear my Birkenstocks. But the fancy version of an economist is wearing the bow tie, so you get the fancy version of me today. So hopefully it doesn't look too wrong because my wife's the one that tied it. So we all have these things that my brother calls DCTs. Default conversation topics. Ever heard of this concept before? He coined it, so hopefully it's making its way around the world. But for instance, he's a tall man. He's 6'8", and so he often gets comments from people whenever they approach him. They say, "Drew, hey, how's the weather up there?" Or some silly, stupid comment, right, about his height, something like that. That's his default conversation topic that he gets. As an economist, when people first find out that I do numbers and they really have no idea what economist is, I get one of two default conversation topics that come up. The first one is someone might ask me, "Hey, how's the stock market doing?" Which I immediately respond with, "Well, I don't know. I'm an economist," right? The second default conversation topic that often comes up is just the general, "Hey, how's the economy doing?" And now that one I have a little bit more to say about than the stock market more generally. And when you guys leave today, if someone finds out, well, maybe your neighbor or coworker finds out that you were at the Economic Indicators breakfast, and they ask you, "Hey, how's the stock market doing?" Unfortunately, you're not going to have any more insight from these presentations to tell your neighbor what happened, okay? But if they do generally ask you, "Hey, how's the economy doing?" you'll have a pretty good idea of what's going on here in Oregon. You'll have a better idea of what's going on nationally. And I think more importantly, we'll bring that back home and what that means for us in the context of Central Oregon, for those of us who live in Bend and the rest of Central Oregon. So that's what we're going to get from today. I'm going to be up here for most of the event. I'm sort of whether you like me or not, I'm going to be here the whole time. But before we bring up the big name folks, I have a little bit of talk that I'm going to give to you guys. So I'm actually going to avoid a lot of the numbers talk. I love avoiding numbers. It's sort of my thing now. So I want to look back a bit. So I want to talk a little bit about maps. I sort of have this love affair with maps. I think they tell us a pretty amazing story. And I think it really comes from when I was a young kid. I sort of was an early, what do you call a history buff, history geek, right? And I often blame my grandmother for this because she was a historian. And on my summer breaks, she'd often take me on research trips across the country. And I have distinct memories of one particular trip when I was in the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. And it's very fitting for Halloween because we found this lost cemetery. And the headstones were actually on the ground, and the stones were made up to look like the people who died. Very creepy. And I have several pictures that I don't have here of me laying down as a middle schooler with frosted tips next to gravestones. So somehow this gave me a love for history and the history buff. So most middle schoolers and high schoolers don't have history paraphernalia on their wall, right? They usually have like sports stars or pop rock stars or whatever. But I had a lot of maps. And one particular map that I had on my wall was of the United States just before the Civil War. Okay, so it was 1959. And it looks something like this. Okay, it's a pretty powerful map, right? What we see here is the states, the free states, the slave states, the demarcation between those two. For those of you who remember your AP history class back in high school, that was the Mason-Dixon line, right? Okay. This is my opportunity to pretend to be a history professor for a while. I think this tells a powerful story, right? It tells us something about a divided country. It tells us something about a bit of foreshadowing, about a conflict to come. And more importantly, it tells a story about a people who were in bondage that will be set free. And it's a pretty powerful story we just get from a map, right? So we don't look at maps like we used to. In fact, believe it or not, I grew up before smartphones. I was driving a car before smartphones. I know I'm a millennial and that's a thing. So when I had to get to where I was going when I first started driving, what did I have to do, right? I had to reach over into that glove box and open up my Rand McNally map, open it up to find out where I had to go, right? Now, we don't do that anymore, do we, right? Now, we see where we need to go in the context of a small rectangular box, right? A little glass window that is perfectly zoomed into our location and shows us exactly what we need to see. We no longer have that giant Rand McNally map on our lap where we can see everything going on. Now, a professor, Susan Crawford, who is a law professor at Harvard, recently said this. Oh, it's cut off a bit. I'll read it for you. She said, "The phone's guidance is better, but the view is not. We're less likely to know what we are driving past. We've lost what's fascinating about a place by not having this bigger picture." There's something lost, right, when we're zoomed in on our phone right? There's a beauty to maps, but there's also a story that we can learn from it. So, for instance, here's a map that we have of the United States that was developed by Microsoft. And what they did, some of you may have seen this map. It got sort of popular, and I think social media, it moved around. But what we see here is every black dot represents a structure, a physical structure that was built, okay? The darker the image means the more dense the structures, and also the taller the structures exist. Now, we can see the impacts of all sorts of things, right? We can see the impacts of topography, of public lands, of urbanizations. We can even see our transportation corridors just by looking at our built structures. This is us. Now, if we zoom in a little further, does this place look familiar? Anyone? Where are we at? Yeah, we're here. If I had a pointer, I'd point out where we're at in the river house. This is us. This is Bend. Now, we don't see the Deschutes River, right? These are just built structures. But we can see a town that was created around the contours of the Deschutes River, right? We can see how our development has progressed through time. You've got the traditional blocks in Old Bend, and then you start seeing the curved streets and cul-de-sacs of newer development. You can even see the sorts of forms of recreation we prefer, right? You can kind of tell where those golf courses are. So many of the maps that we see every day show traditional boundaries, things like state lines, national lines, counties, etc., city limits. And most of these boundaries were created between the 17th and the 19th century. So these are well-entrenched boundaries that we've seen for years. Now, a team of geographers led by two people, Garrett Nelson and Alistair Ray, decided that they wanted to reimagine what the boundaries that we traditionally look at, how they're formed, and how we look at the United States and the interconnectedness of communities. So what they did was they took the United States and they took commuting patterns from the Census Bureau, and they decided to say, what is the interconnectedness between home and people's economic activity? Home and their job, home and where they get goods and services rendered to them. And this is what they found. This is what their map looked like. A dramatic interconnectedness of some communities. And I don't think it's particularly, revealing for some of us that know some of these communities. But what we see is places like the Inland Empire, so the Spokane, sort of Tri-Cities, Boise, along the Columbia Plateau. There's a dramatic interconnectedness of those communities, of those economies there. They sort of form this sort of cohesive unit. It was really telling, I think, to be able to see sort of the interconnectedness of some of the broader economies that we think of. But let's zoom into us here in Central Oregon. What do we see, right? We have a little bit of arms that reach out into the Willamette Valley, a few arms that sort of reach up into Portland there. But for the most part, we're sort of on an island. We're sort of interconnected with ourselves. All those little branches and arms are all just Central Oregon communities. So we're sort of living that island life here, right? Aloha. Now, their analysis went a step further. They said to themselves, well, let's take these interconnected communities and let's reimagine what the United States looks like. Let's redraw state lines based on these economic connections rather than just sort of our traditional boundaries that were given to us. Now, unfortunately, we lose the beautiful, nice, clean lines that we get, because everything, sort of west of the Mississippi was just sort of these clean, the Utahs and Colorados of the world, right? They're a little messier now. But they sort of lumped all these places together and reimagined if we did states based on economic connections, this is what it would look like. And once again, if we look closer at the West Coast, if we zoom in on our area, what do we see? Where are we? It's weird. We're the only area that's not really lumped in with one of these states. A bit offensive, I suppose. In fact, this is the way they describe it in their research. This white area, which is maybe figurative and literal, I don't know, this is the state of this area is sparsely populated, and the people who commute here don't necessarily gravitate to a single urban area. Yikes. So that's not good for us necessarily. We don't get one of these fancy new state titles. As we go forward for the rest of the morning, I have sort of two conclusions that I think that we should take with us as context as we listen to both Josh and Tom give their presentations, okay? The first one is that I would argue that Central Oregon should not be lumped in with large portions of sparsely populated Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Nevada, right? Us being in part of this sort of white blob doesn't really make sense. Instead, I think we should think of ourselves as sort of one interconnected community. We are Central Oregon, and oftentimes I find when I'm going from community to community that we're overly focused on our individual communities that we live within Central Oregon. So people might be Bend-centric, or they might live in Prineville, and all they care about is Prineville and what's going on there. Instead, I would argue that we should have a regional perspective. We're living that island life a little bit. We're in this together, okay? So Bend and Redmond might be the hub of employment and services, but the hub does not spin without spokes, and the spokes that we have are our rural communities that surround us. They provide an important supply of labor as well as other support services and natural resources. So we need to stop parsing ourselves out and thinking of ourselves at a hyper-local level like that. Let's think of ourselves as one cohesive region. We are Central Oregon. And more importantly, it looks a little silly in this context, right? For me to be so concerned about the neighborhood that I live in or the town that I live in when those little 3 dots there are us. That's Central Oregon, right? So we need to think of ourselves, there's power in numbers there, and think of ourselves as one cohesive unit. Second, the second takeaway I think we need as context as we prepare for the other presentations is to understand that we are, yes, our own region, but we are connected with other places. So the research from Ray and Nelson, they found that we aren't connected with one single metropolitan area. Okay, well, I would argue, yes, that's true. We don't have an interconnectedness with one single metropolitan area. I would argue we are really interconnected with lots or a multitude of metropolitan areas. Places like Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, even LA. This is a heat map that shows us where residents are moving from to Central Oregon. Obviously, we see this dramatic interconnectedness between all the major metro areas along the West Coast. So we cannot ignore what is going on off-island, for instance, right? We are being shaped currently and have been shaped historically by people both moving here from these places as well as the interconnectedness of businesses with these places. So as we hear updates about Central Oregon's economy, the national economy, and Oregon's economy sort of more generally, think of them in the context of us being one cohesive region. We are Central Oregon, but also remember that we are constantly being influenced and shaped by the major metro areas across the West. Thank you. There's 2 other people who are going to speak today. I was sort of just greasing the wheels here, but the real content, the meat that we're going to get for this morning, the thing that you really came for, are from our 2 guest speakers who are going to give us some bigger picture concepts here. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Potowski. He is the director of the Northwest Economic Research Center, NERC. Dr. Potowski retired in September of 2017. Congratulations. Big deal. As professor and chair of the Portland State University Department of Economics. He formerly served as the state economist, the head state economist for Oregon. He received a PhD in economics from the University of Colorado in 1981. And please help me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Potowski. There's that for you.
All right, thank you. My stuff I see is starting to come up behind me. Even though we're in the basement right now, it really is a nice, safe place, especially for the brokers here. There are no windows, so jumping is not allowed. You'll be just fine. So, as Damon said, what I'm going to do is really give more of a broad picture. as he said, there is interconnection here in Central Oregon with the rest of the state, with the rest of the U.S., internationally. All those aspects have a bearing on what actually happens here. So I'm going to do this sort of higher level overview, give some context of Pacific Northwest. I'll make some mention of Central Oregon too. And then Josh will follow with a more drilled down analysis of what's happening mostly in the central area and statewide. So to start that off, as was mentioned, I'm with NERC. That's the Northwest Economic Research Center. We're located at Portland State University. We're about 6 years old. I invite you to go to our website and see all the projects. We also do a forecast for the Portland metro area that comes out twice a year, and we just released our last one 2 weeks ago. If you can't remember NERC, just remember we're one letter away from nerd. All right, a little bit about the economy in the Pacific Northwest. Going to start with the broadest measure we have of economic activity is gross domestic product. And as you see this graph here, you look at those three little red dots, those are forecasts done by the Federal Reserve Bank. And those are important because those are showing a little bit of a slowing down. And that's going to be somewhat of a theme I'm going to have as we go through this. Now, I want to note that the third quarter was just released about a week ago, and the estimate came in at a 3.5% growth, which is really quite good. The second quarter was 4.2%, which is even stronger growth. And the last quarterly growth at an annualized rate that we had above 4% was back in the third quarter of 2014 at 4.9%. So this is really some more recent, faster growth than we've seen in quite a few years. This expansion right now is the second longest expansion on record. It's at 112 months. The expansion in the 60s was 106 months. That was now our third longest. But still, the one in the 90s at 120 months is the longest one we have. So we just have 8 more months, basically till next June, to possibly have this being the longest expansion. The interesting thing about this particular expansion, though, is that although overall, once we reach about 10 years of expansion, it becomes the longest, we will have added more jobs than what happened in the 90s. But percentage-wise, it's going to be less. And the reason that is that we were bottom fishing as we came out of this recession, not doing much at all. And then finally, we sort of kicked in around 2014, 2015, and had much stronger growth. A good friend of mine who retired from Standard & Poor's, the chief economist, David Weiss, he's sort of like, and he goes, you look at these expansion parts, you try to make comparisons, and he goes, one of the comparisons I make is what were the drugs of choices at the time? Well, guess. So he said in the 60s, it was marijuana and speed. In the 90s, Prozac and Viagra. And then now it's Humira for arthritis, and some habits are hard to kick, Viagra again. Now, you should not be surprised, right? Because really, from the 60s to now, we're really talking about the same group of people. If you young people are out there, turn to somebody with white hair, gray hair next to you. They'll explain what I mean of these drugs of choice through the years. All right. So with that in mind, these are the annual percentage growth rates. And you'll notice that the last time we had a full year growth above 3% was back in 2005, right? So, good 13 years ago. Now, this one may break through. There are estimates of thinking that this may annualized be at 3.1% for 2018 once we get the fourth quarter numbers that come in. But the idea that we can sustain 3% growth annualized from now through 2025 is really a pipe dream. And I'm going to come back to that. And one of the reasons why I think that's going to be a pipe dream is you'll see. The second quarter GDP, when we break down, what was the growth? What was really causing the growth? Really, consumer spending is really what's leading things and has done so for the past, I'd say, 2 years. Durable consumer goods were strong. Personal savings were up. Business investment, though, was slightly down for the second quarter. Non-residential structures were up, but the only main reason for that was because finally mining came back and well drilling. Oil prices started to rise back up, and they started going back and now trying to get that shale oil out of North Dakota and parts of Ohio and Texas. Housing, housing wasn't doing too bad nationally, and then there was really weakness in the first and second quarters of this year, both in single and multifamily, in terms of permitting and new homes coming up. Agricultural, net international trade. Agricultural goods exports were up 100.7%. Now, who would guess? And one of the main reasons for that was soybeans. Exports of soybeans went through the roof. Why? And why would soybeans move GDP numbers, the whole growth rate? Tariffs. And what it was, the Chinese producers and users of U.S. soybeans said, China's going to slap a tariff on this. We got to get these things in before the price goes up. And so all of a sudden now we have what I would say is a false signal of extra growth for the second quarter. That 4.2% was really pushed up by a one-time event almost. Now, what I don't have here, and I'm going to really quick go over it, is the third quarter came through. And in the third quarter, if you look at these same items here, consumer spending, once again, consumer spending really pushed the numbers. And the number for that third quarter, again, is 3.5%. Well over 2.5% of that amount was due to consumer spending. Business investment added another 2%. But net exports was a negative. We almost lost 2% of growth from that because that was that one-time deal. And really, we had net exports of goods falling quite a bit, and then only a much bigger rise for imports going up. And then government overall is about the same as this one. But the interesting thing about the third quarter that bumped things up, one of the things that's included in business investment are inventories. Because GDP tries to estimate what's current activity. And if businesses produce something and nobody buys it, it becomes inventory and you've got to count it. So you stick it into business investment. And then if they drop inventories, that's a decrease from business investment, right? Well, if you take out inventories, all of U.S. business investment, non-residential, residential, was a slight negative. There was a big boost in inventories in the third quarter. So if you take that away, that 3.5% is down to about 1.5%. Now, your building inventories is useful, so even just have it 1%. That's a 2.5% rate. So I really think given that they had that rise up, their inventories are high, the fourth quarter is going to be slower than 3.5%. I'd expect it to be probably in the low 2%, maybe high 1% range going forward. That's exactly what I was talking about. I forgot I had the slide exactly on that, where you see that investment, and there's my reason down there on the bottom. So we can proceed ahead. Total non-farm employment, our broadest measure. This is where Damon's group gets these numbers. As we look at the U.S., take a look at the most recent periods. You can see sort of a slowing down, but still relatively good growth. You add in Oregon to this. That's Washington. Washington had a little bit of a bump up. Oregon there, you can see some bump up, but then a slowing down and then Idaho's pretty much with Oregon. And some of the reason for this is that when you get to the mature stage of a business cycle, it's tough to have resources available all of a sudden. When you're coming out of a recession, people are unemployed, they got the skills you need. When demand starts to go up, you can hire them right away, you get pretty strong growth. But once you get to a point where, everybody that almost wants a job has one, and then your reasons for having unemployment because of the business cycle have gone away, what's left now is either the churn, people simply change jobs and they're unemployed for a period of time, or there's a skill mismatch. It's a more structural aspect that's out there. And that's sort of at the stage that we're now at. And so it's natural. It's not a horrible thing to have slower growth, but it's a natural consequence of being at the later stages of a business cycle. Here are the civilian unemployment rates. A little bit closer to home, you can see that the unemployment rate for Oregon, which is about in the middle there with the U.S., if you can just see at the very end, say 2016 out towards 2018, this goes out to September, you can see a flattening of that unemployment rate. And those tend to be indications that we're at some aspect of full employment. Because if that unemployment rate can't keep falling down any further, it's gotten rid of all the business cycle reasons, and we just have the structural and the churning that's left. And so almost all of those are pretty much flat at those later years. The civilian labor force participation rate, another indication you're at full employment. A lot of this drop, by the way, is due to demographics, because this is a percent of the population. As the population gets older, it naturally comes down. But even if you population adjust it, demographically adjust it, and Josh has great slides on that on his blog, you'll see that this is probably coming down a little bit faster than what just the demographics would say. But notice where I have that circle. Another indication, when there's jobs out there, people know there are jobs, they start to re-enter the labor force, right? So those of you that have a 20-year-old or something living in your basement, in good conscience, you can ask them to leave. There are jobs out there. It's okay. Retake your home. All right, interest rates. I do a lot of history here because, you got to remember, even though interest rates have been rising, and you can see at the very right-hand side of that diagram how they've been going up, they still are historically very, very low. But at the same time, what happens is that when you've been used to very low interest rates and they start to go up, they do have an impact, even though historically they're very low. And we're starting to see that impact happen. Now, the Federal Reserve has raised the federal funds rate 3 times this year. The expectation is one more hike of 25 basis points in December meeting. And there's an expectation of maybe 3 hikes in 2019. Now, those 3 hikes in 2019, you listen to analysts, and it's very interesting. You have some of them say, inflation's not really a problem. The growth we think is going to slow down. There's reason for the Fed to not do 3 times in 2019. They're only going to raise it twice. Then you have another group of people that say, I think the inflation may actually get a little stronger. If we see a little stronger growth in the economy and so on, the Fed may go 4 times in 2019. And if they do that, there's chances then we could be heading for a much slower growth, maybe even the horrible R-word recession. All right, so I've got Where's Waldo picture here, because when we're at this stage of a business cycle and everybody is looking for signs that we're either at full employment and what's happening to 2 particular measures that the data seems to be missing. Given that we're at full employment, we've had strong growth, we should be seeing inflation starting to perk up more, we should be seeing wages growing faster. This is the sort of the consequence at this stage of a business cycle, but they haven't really shown up in the data yet. So let's take a look. Consumer Price Index. We have here the volatile one is the total CPI, the more general one, the one that doesn't bounce around as much, is the core, where we strip out volatile energy and food items. But you can see all of that is really relative to about 2%. Has been pretty benign, really, since almost the recession, which is the shaded bar. I threw this in really quick because when we look at inflation, maybe closer to home, we used to have a good measure for Oregon, which was the Portland-Salem CPI for urban wage earners. And you can see there it actually shows inflation getting a little stronger, especially in 2017. And a lot of that, by the way, has to do with the housing costs and the component of the CPI. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics decided we weren't important enough, and they dropped that measure at the end of 2017. And they introduced a new measure called the Pacific Cpi. So I compared that to the West, and you can see both those measures show a little bit stronger inflation than what's overall for the U.S. So we're having a situation here where I think the pressures, the business cycle, and so on are starting to show up a little sooner in the data than we're seeing the rest of the U.S. The personal consumption expenditure inflation measure is the one used by the Federal Reserve. And I have a line there that has the Fed target. And they're using that as a guideline to say, if inflation starts to get above that, that's when we might want to think about hiking rates a little bit faster. Now, I've got a little picture there. Maybe this is part of the data. You can almost see from 2015, sort of a slow sort of drift upwards as we get to more recent times. And so maybe we found Waldo. Maybe this is an indication that inflation is here. So let's check, see if there's Waldo. Oh, it's Jerome Powell. It's the chair of the Federal Reserve. And, it looks like, he's looking off in the distance, trying to see in the data, is inflation there or not? Or he's trying to read the latest tweet from President Trump. Either one. All right, let's turn to wages. This is real wages, adjusted for inflation. Once again, as you start to get towards 2015, you see a little bit of an uptick. And if I change that to nominal wage growth, percentage changes, I really think we have some Waldo here. And this is national. Josh has figures on the state and local areas. You are starting to see these wages. Labor markets are tighter. And so I really think this is part of the thing. And we know labor markets are tighter because I talk to construction people and so on. You can tell all over that it's getting tougher and tougher to find workers. Now, we're doing our best job, by the way. I was in Starbucks the other day, and I bought coffee and a little egg sandwich or something like that, and the bill came to $6. And so I took a $10 bill out of my wallet and a $1 bill for get a round change, right, out of that $6, and I gave it to the young barista. The young man very kindly gave me back the $1 and explained that my bill was $6 and I gave him too much money. So we are hiring everybody we can. Now, I shouldn't be too tough on the young man. Being a millennial, he's probably unfamiliar with the use of cash or views cash transactions as some pagan ritual practiced by older generations. All right, a little bit into housing. U.S. housing permits. One thing I want you to see here is right at the end, you can see that multifamily really flattening out. And then also single family starting to flatten out also just at the end. But really, if you take a look at that single family, it's back to a rate that we had in 1993 for the U.S. So we're making more homes, we're getting more homes out there, but we're at a rate relative to a very smaller population. It's no wonder we're getting some aspects of affordability problems and housing prices going up really fast, because we have some pretty strong demand out there, and supply isn't really catching up to it. These are housing permits. I looked a little bit at Washington and Oregon here. I have Bend also located here. What we see both in single and multifamily homes, multifamily, that's been happening for quite a while, but more recently, even single family. And you can see these permits. A lot of them are negative across the board here. Boise is still somewhat off the charts. And what are the reasons here? Really, two, in my mind. One is construction costs are way up. Amazing. Even PVC. The plastic, that's getting more expensive. The workers are getting more expensive. The land. So it's tough for developers to make margin on what they're trying to sell. I mean, it's tough to get into these starter homes. When you got these high costs, you almost get yourself forced into doing these higher end ones. And that's not where the true whole demand is at. And then also affordability matters this time around. Back in the early days of the wild, wild west of home expansion in 2003 through 6, affordability didn't matter back then. If you needed a mortgage, you could easily get a mortgage, right? You filled out your mortgage application. You do have a gainful occupation? Yeah, I'm an axe murderer. Fine. Here's your mortgage. But today, it bites. You have to have a really better credit score. And on top of it, think about, I won't go too deep into this, but, students, for example, college-educated people tend to be the strongest homeowners. And when they are saddled with, $30,000 in debt, it's tough for them to qualify for a mortgage. So these are headwinds, I think, are going on this. I took a quick little look at Zillow, by the way. In terms of affordability, they have a price of home to personal income ratio. And the higher that ratio is, the less affordable, right? And so I took a look at the 370 metro areas that Zillow lists. And Bend was number 27 in rank out of 370. Portland was 37, Grants Pass was 13. All of the 8 metros that Zillow looked at, Bend being the furthest of the east, the other is along the I-5 corridor, all were in the top 70. So affordability definitely is an issue here. This is the house price index. Just wanted to show you that sort of slowing rate for Oregon. And if you take a look at the Case-Shiller, which is the broadest measure for their 20 metro areas, look at how much Portland has really slowed down. Quite tremendously. And it really, in my mind, is that construction cost aspect and the affordability issue that's really hitting there. I took a quick look. Bend is not included in this. Took a quick look at Bend. And you've had tremendous double-digit price increases for homes. But right around mid-2016, it dropped below the double-digit range. So you've actually seen some slowing too, but you're slowing rather than being at about 5%, like Portland is. You're in sort of the mid to low 8% range, which is still pretty hefty increases. But still, there is a slowing. Quick economic outlook. A little quote here, disclaimer. You know, it's like a cross-eyed javelin thrower. Don't win many accuracy contests, but you keep the crowd's attention, where that javelin's going to land. Right? So this comes from the Wall Street Journal consensus. Notice I took this out before the third quarter. The actual third quarter came in at 3.5%, so the consensus was almost right on target. But notice they see this slower growth. Because we've goosed the economy with various things, and that goosing sort of settles down and ends as we go forward. So we're getting slower growth. Oil prices, pretty benign. That's good news. That's going down. Housing starts and so on. And then the consumer price index, still pretty benign out there. Unemployment, sort of bouncing up just a little bit, but pretty much stable. And then interest rates that drift up. All green is good here. In terms of this view from the Philadelphia Fed, and Oregon's been green for quite a while. And to give you a sense, the country is actually doing pretty well. This is a forecast from Josh's office, and you can see they're looking at some slowing. I'm on the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors, along with Orrin Teeter, who's here today. You know, and one of the issues we have is, you know, where are we? Are we going to slow? Is it going to speed up? Tough issues. And this is population. I'm going a little bit faster because I see my red light is flashing in my eyes here about my time. But I want to get to headwinds and tailwinds. I'm going to skip that and go right to this. Really, you know, China is one of the issues that we have to be concerned about. And given that I have 20 seconds left, I just want to leave you with this, is that when you have recessions don't end because of old age. They end because of bad behavior, either bad behavior from policy or bad behavior in the private sector. And the bad behavior I'm seeing right now is coming from the federal government. And that bad behavior is you do not goose the economy by cutting taxes and increasing federal spending when you're at full employment. You do that during recessions. You do that now, you risk the chance of having higher inflation. You don't get those resources coming out when you're already almost fully employing them. So my fear is that with the tariffs also causes higher prices to occur for us. You're leading right down the road to the Fed saying, I'm going to have to raise rates even faster, and you get the classic Fed-induced recession. So I don't see any recession for 2019. I think the danger is when we go to 2020. Thank you. So are you going? Oh, you get to introduce.
I get to, yeah. Thanks, Tom.
Okay.
All right, now it is my pleasure to introduce a friend of mine, Josh Lehner. Like I said, he's now a new Central Oregonian. He is one of us. Let's hopefully give him a warm welcome because we love having smart, intelligent young people moving to Bend. That's always a positive thing. Stealing them from Portland, yes, stick it to the man. So Josh is an economist with the state of Oregon. He is with the Office of Economic Analysis. He develops the quarterly Oregon economic forecast, including outlooks for employment, income, and housing. Mr. Lehner also acts as the state's de facto vice economist by forecasting revenues for the Oregon Lottery, the Oregon Judicial Department, and the state marijuana and tobacco taxes. Outside of work, Josh enjoys spending time with his wife and kids, traveling the state, and consuming Oregon's craft beverages. Got a lot of those here. That's maybe why he moved, I don't know. So please help me in welcoming to the stage Josh Lehner.
Thanks, man. All right. Thanks, Damon. Thanks, everyone, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and Damon's absolutely right. I just recently moved across the mountains to be a member of Central Oregon's community, just like everybody else that has done the same thing each and every year forever. And I have a population slide coming up here. But it's, as Tom was saying, right now it's a little bit of an interesting time in the economy in the sense that the U.S. is picking up, right? The U.S. growth is starting to pick up a little bit, partly due to the deficit finance, tax cuts, and spending increases. We have the oil investment coming back into the Dakotas and the oil patch and that sort of stuff. But here in Oregon and the Northwest more broadly, we're starting to slow down. We're starting to reach some of our supply side constraints, and the biggest one being there is labor, right? It's not that local businesses are starting to struggle with growth or with the expansion or falling sales or anything like that. It's that we're running out of people to employ. And so growth is necessarily slowing as the business cycle matures because everybody has a job again for the most part. And so that you see here in the chart behind you, this first one is just simple. Year-over-year job growth in Oregon versus the U.S., similar to one of the ones Tom was showing just a little bit ago. You notice a couple things. First, you notice that slowing we're seeing in recent years. And so it's important to keep a point out here that the slowing growth isn't necessarily a problem in and of itself, right? The economy has never been better. Your business sales have never been larger, and we're continuing to get bigger and healthier every single year. It's just that pace of increase is slowing down a little bit as the business cycle matures. The other thing you'll notice here is that the blue line, the dark blue line, which is Oregon, is much more volatile over the entire business cycle than the U.S., than is the typical state or the average state. And that's for two main reasons. One is our industrial structure. Oregon, we still make things. Our manufacturing sector, our goods producing sector, our natural resources is still a much larger share of our economy than it is nationwide. Now we've seen a decline in manufacturing and a decline in our resource industries, just like we have nationwide. It's a much smaller share of our economy today than it was 2 generations ago. But that decline has been less pronounced due to our more modern mix of manufacturing, right? We don't have auto parts. We don't have textile mills that they used to have in the South. We have aerospace, which Bend used to have more aerospace, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But we still have a little bit of a presence. We have semiconductors, high-tech manufacturers, mostly over in the Willamette Valley and increasingly just in the Portland region or Hillsborough, as the case may be. Our metal makers, we lost some aluminum 15 years ago or 20 years ago, but we still have some metal makers and some metal fabricators. These things have done better than the automobile makers and the textile mills and things like that. Now, we do have one industry that looks just like the Rust Belt, and of course that's our historic ties to the timber industry. Our timber belt here in the heart of timber country in Oregon, our declines in that industry and in the communities that used to all have an individual mill looks just like the declines we've seen throughout the country in the Rust Belt or the old Farm Belt and things like that. So that's one of the reasons why Oregon is more volatile. The other reason is population growth. Anytime there are jobs available here in Oregon, people want to live here due to the strong regional economy and the high quality of life. And of course, here in Central Oregon, we have that in spades for the most part, but across the whole Pacific Northwest and Oregon is certainly the case. And migration flows are very boom-bust over the business cycle. During a recession, people hunker down. They don't move very much, but as soon as incomes start to rise, job opportunities increase. Here come the migration flows, and that adds to the boom-bust nature of the Oregon and Central Oregon economies. And given that we spend many more years in expansion than we do in a recession, Oregon comes out ahead over the entire business cycle. We're more volatile, good times are better, the bad times are even tougher, but over 5, 10, 15 years, Oregon comes out ahead. Here in Oregon, Tom's talking about full employment. Where's Waldo? We're looking for that sort of stuff. And even at the state level, we're starting to see a lot of the good growth come in terms of wages. Oregon wages are up 3 to 4% a year for the past 3 or 4 years, right? So the U.S. is just now picking up to 3%. Well, in Oregon, we've been above that for quite some time, and even, same numbers, similar numbers here in Bend. And this is the share of the working age population that has a job or is actively looking for work in terms of the labor force participation. And here in Deschutes County, we're all the way back to where we were prior to the Great Recession, and these numbers are better than they were back in 2000, right? I think you'd have to go all the way back to the late 1970s in the heyday of the timber industry to see equivalent numbers here in Central Oregon in terms of the number of people that actually have a job. And so this recovery has spread out throughout the state. Every industry is growing again. Every region of the state is growing again. At this point in the cycle, after 9 years of economic expansion, we're seeing good news is everywhere. And we're starting to see the recovery reach all racial and ethnic groups. We still have some massive racial disparities when it comes to incomes and employment and housing affordability and all that sort of stuff, but these racial gaps are not increasing over time. They're staying relatively the same, and there's some news, some of the latest data points coming from the Census Bureau for 2017 show that some of these racial gaps are actually shrinking a little bit, which is a big improvement relative to much of our history. So moving forward, we're expecting this good news to continue. And more importantly, along with a strong economy and a tight labor market comes the feel-good nature of the business cycle. And what do I mean by that? That means money in their pocket, right? Household incomes are rising. Household incomes here in Central Oregon are rising 9% a year for the last 4 years. Not adjusted for inflation, so adjusted for inflation, we're talking 7% increases, which is a massive number. And it's not because everybody's getting a 7% wage increase, or maybe your profits at your business are going up 7% every year. That's not what's driving these numbers. When it comes to people in the middle part of the income distribution, and these are median household numbers, which if you think back to your math class, the median is the midpoint. So 50% of people earn less, 50% of people earn more than the numbers you see on your screen. When it comes to people in the middle part of the income distribution and the people at the bottom part of the income distribution, the only thing they have are wages, right? They don't have rental properties. They don't have capital gains or other types of investment income. So they're fully reliant on the labor market and the economy to generate any sort of income growth for their families. So the question is, do you have a job, yes or no? And we're 5% more people every year are getting a job here in Central Oregon, so we're putting 5% more people back to work, so their incomes are going up because they went from no job to a job. Then it's how many hours do you work? And in the last 4 years, Central Oregon, we're putting 5% more people back to work and 9% more people back to work full-time, right? And so you're getting more hours worked, and then on top of that, you're getting hourly wage increases of about 3%. So you put all that together, we're putting so many more people back to work, they're working more hours, and they're getting wage gains on top of that. That's how you get these really big jumps in incomes for those in the middle and bottom part of the income distribution. And this only happens in the mature stages of a business cycle or at full employment or when all these sort of good things start to come out of the economy. And we're finally there. We've been there for a few years now. We're expected to be there at least for another couple years. Risks are mounting over the medium term. We'll see how the Federal Reserve responds to the next 18 months or so. Then we can understand maybe exactly how long the business cycle will last. That said, we know we have some issues, right? We have all this good news. All the data flow is healthy. All the news we're seeing come out of the numbers, poverty rates, caseloads for needs-based programs, household income numbers. They're all looking really, really good at this point. But we know we have some issues, the chief among them being housing affordability. And I can't stress enough to you, while it's most pronounced here in Central Oregon, the Bend numbers Tom's talking about, you're in the top 1% for least affordable metros in the entire country. That's more severe than much of the rest of the state, but that said, the rest of the state is facing the same affordability challenges as we are here in Central Oregon and in Portland. For example, Hood River. Hood River is in the top 1% for least affordable rural communities in the entire country, right? So it's a statewide problem. The difference this time around in terms of affordability isn't just the rising home prices, which are outpacing income gains some years. It's also the fact that we're underbuilding. This chart just kind of shows you that we're building significantly less housing across almost the entire state today relative to prior to the bubble. Not what we were doing at the peak of the bubble, but prior to that, 15, 20 years ago, are we building more or less than we did then? And the answer is we're building significantly less. Here in Deschutes County, the numbers have picked up the last couple of years of new construction in Deschutes. It doesn't look too out of line with population growth and things like that, but that doesn't make up for the shortfall that was created in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12 when we built nothing. And that's the real stress, the real source of the stress in the housing market is that lack of housing production during the depth of the Great Recession. And so this imbalance where we have demand rising, population rising, and housing supply yet to fully catch up with it is the source of our affordability challenges statewide, for our rural communities as well. Crook County, 96th percentile for affordability, meaning only 4% of rural counties in the U.S. have better or worse affordability than Crook County, and Jefferson's not too far behind in the 85th percentile. So Jefferson County is more unaffordable than 85% of rural counties across the U.S., right? So this is a very pronounced issue throughout our state, and of course, the challenges might appear daunting. They shouldn't be. But the issue here is, again, when the jobs are coming available, people want to move here. And you can see in front of you Central Oregon population growth. It's picking up. We're in the 2 to 3, almost up to 3% a year population growth for Central Oregon. And of course, this isn't anything new. This isn't anything new to the Pacific Northwest. This isn't anything new to Oregon. This certainly isn't anything new to Bend. It's important to keep in mind that people have been packing up, filling their wagons, putting backpacks on their back, moving to this part of the world, not just since Lewis and Clark first explored it with the expedition, but people have been moving to this part of the world since Pangea was starting to break up, and we had the ice bridge across the Bering Sea, right, where people were walking to come to this part of the world, and North America was forming. And when, of course, we know the one person that also followed those early migrants across the land bridge was that little guy down there in the corner. Sasquatch originally came from Asia, but now he's over here, and he followed them as he was following his food source. And so this has been going on a long time. The difference that we're seeing today is the fact that we're not building enough housing, unlike past decades and past generations when we had a better housing supply. Now, Central Oregon's a little bit different than the rest of the state, and certainly different than the Willamette Valley. It's kind of the types of people who move here, right? The people that move to Central Oregon look a little bit different than the people that move to the Willamette Valley, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's that when people are first graduating high school or college, they're 20, 25 years old, they're unattached, they're single, maybe they don't have a job, they show up with a U-Haul, they move to the biggest cities. They move to Portland, they move to Seattle, they move to San Francisco or New York or places like that. And once they settle down, they begin their careers, maybe they get married, maybe they go to school, things like that. Then they start to branch out and move to some of the smaller areas, some of the secondary metropolitan areas, or from a size perspective. And so here in Central Oregon, we kind of get two bumps of people that are moving. The first one, the largest component, would be retirees. A lot of them are coming north from California, of course, but we're getting retirees from throughout the country. And then second, behind the retirees, would be young families. You're getting people in their 30s and their 40s looking to set down roots, buy a home, start a family. Maybe they already have little kids, things like that. So those are kind of the two primary components of people moving to Central Oregon. And then, of course, they disproportionately have moderate to high incomes, and a larger share of them have a college degree relative to educational attainment within the local communities. Of course, from the migration, if you look at the latest IRS tax statistics, 38% are coming from California, another 20% are coming from Portland, another 4% from the rest of Oregon, so Medford, Salem, Pendleton, places like that, and then another 4% from the rest of Washington, whether it's Tri-Cities or Spokane, as part of the Columbia Plateau, as Damon was talking about. And so this growth, this population growth, has a big impact on the community, right? You experience growing pains. There's no question. All of Oregon, for the most part, is experiencing these growing pains where we have a bigger population. It's good in some respects. It's great in some respects. It means you have more consumer demand. It means you have more clients for your business. It means your revenues are increasing because the customer base is larger today. But we also have increased congestion, not only on our roads, but in our schools and at the airport and all that sort of stuff. And so these growing pains are real. They're not imaginary. But that said, these growing pains are much more preferable to the pangs of death, right? In terms of the dying communities and the places where people are actively packing up and leaving, and the places are shrinking that you see throughout the Midwest and places like that. It's kind of an either-or situation. Very rarely do you see a healthy regional economy that's not growing. There's either shrinking or you're growing, and so you're dealing with one of these challenges, and growing pains are much easier to deal with than shrinking communities where you're having to tear up roads and you're having to cut back on services and close schools and all this sort of stuff, and cuts art programs and close the community centers and all that sort of stuff that we're dealing with some communities throughout the Midwest and New England and places like that that aren't growing. Those pains are much worse and harder to deal with than the growing pains that we're certainly experiencing here throughout the Northwest. So who's moving here? Again, is the young families, and it was the retirees. You translate this into some sort of household formation, tie it back to the housing market. You can see the biggest increase are in some of our older age brackets. Now, it's important to realize that this increase in households that are 60, 70, 80 years old over the next decade aren't all new residents. A lot of these are current residents that are just aging into the next age bracket, as you see in the chart in front of you, even though some of them are new. Now, you take a look at the younger ones, those in the 20s and the 30s and maybe the early 40s, most of these households will be new. Most of these households will be people actively packing up and moving to Central Oregon. And that's where a lot of the growth is going to come from, both in the near future and then longer term as they have kids and they grow up in the community and things like that. And tying it back to the housing market, it's important to realize that the stories that millennials didn't want to buy a house, they wanted to live in an apartment in the city center their whole life, were vastly overblown as of about 8 years ago. Now, it's true, most of them did live in an apartment in the center cities of Portland and Seattle 8 years ago, but that's because of their age and it's due to the economy. They couldn't afford to buy a house because they didn't have a good job. They couldn't qualify. The mortgage standards are rising, as Tom's talking about. And then they were also 22, 23 years old. Fast forward to today, the median age or the mode age, the most common age in the U.S. and the most common age for a millennial in the U.S. is 28 years old. And so as you age from your early 20s, where it's pretty cool to live above a bar and enjoy the nightlife in a big city, to your early 30s, where maybe you are starting to settle down, get married, have kids, you want to buy a house, that single-family home in the good school district looks a lot better at 35 than it does at 25 when that's not really where your mind is looking. And so by the time you're in your mid-30s, everywhere I've looked in Oregon when I've gone around and given presentations, by the time you're in your mid-30s, households are 50-50, owner-renter. In Bend, I did this math a couple years ago, I haven't updated it yet, it was 37. So by the time you're 37 in Deschutes County, you're 50% owner, 50% renter. And I wouldn't be surprised, given the trends we've seen the last couple of years, that number's come down. So that 50-50 split in Bend would be, 34, 35 years old today too, which fits in with this overall theme. So in terms of the types of housing that we need, and that's a big discussion we're having throughout the state, in terms of increasing density, allowing for townhomes, getting rid of the apartment bans in so many of our neighborhoods, things like that. That is a big component if we want to maintain our current land use laws. Having increased density and townhomes and things like that will go a long way to helping with the housing supply. But that said, we can't ignore the fact that if you look at surveys and you look at the actual data coming out of the Census Bureau, at the end of the day, most people do prefer to live in a detached single-family home with a yard and ideally in a good school district. And so we have to have some sort of balance where we are making sure we have adequate land supply within our UGBs to accommodate the growth that we want to see and that people actually want to buy, but at the same time realizing that on a generational pendulum swing, the increased demand to live near the city centers and all the consumer services that come with restaurants and nightlife and things like that, that's here to stay. That's not going to go all the way away. And so having more housing options in the closer-in neighborhoods is certainly very viable, and it's something we need to make sure we ensure happens moving forward. We need all types of housing to meet the demands, because this population growth that's coming out is saying here in Central Oregon, we're going to see 5,000 new residents every year, basically for as far as the eye can see. That translates into about 2,000 new households every year for about as far as the eye can see. Now, the business cycle will make that ebb and flow over time, but as of right now, the forecast for population coming out of Portland State University, that's what they're saying, and I'm just translating that into household formation and type of housing that people are buying and things like that. So the outlook overall is positive, right? Again, the economy is good. It's doing better than it has in quite some time, and it's expected to continue to bear fruit. And sales are increasing, wages are increasing, employment's increasing, but we're just starting to slow down a little bit further as the business cycle matures. Finally, I'll leave you on something that's a little bit happier note, maybe. It's at least fun, right, to prove that we're not all dismal scientists in the economics profession, and that has to do with our vice economy. It's growing really quickly, and right, our alcohol cluster in the state, our breweries, wineries, distilleries, distributors, specialty retail shops, and the like, have added more jobs this economic cycle than has one of the state's economic pillars, which is high tech, right? They've added more jobs in alcohol than we have in high tech this cycle, which is pretty astonishing when you think about it. And then, of course, they have nothing to do with each other. But just to help frame the discussion for how well our cluster is doing, this is a helpful one. And the real economic impact from alcohol doesn't necessarily just come from imbibing the beverages, although that's the part we enjoy the most. It has to do with the broader economic impact. We're using Oregon-grown hops. We're using Oregon malted barley more and more as Oregon State's ramping up their program. We're using local water. It's value-added manufacturing. We're taking raw ingredients, turning them into a more valuable product, selling it increasingly around the world as a traded sector industry. And then there's all these ancillary industries that build up upon it. So 40% of the U.S. brew house manufacturers in the entire country are located here in Oregon. So when a brewery opens up in South Carolina or Texas or Minneapolis or whatever the case may be, there's a 40% chance they're using Oregon-made products to make it, right? The vessels and the brew house system and all that sort of stuff. And our hopes is we can get something like that with the marijuana industry. Right now, we just have 5,000 to 10,000 growing and retailing jobs in marijuana, right? That's all we have right now, but we're hoping maybe we can get new lab testing equipment, maybe DUII testing equipment. We can build up branding consultants so that when other states legalize, when Missouri legalizes or Kansas legalizes, Kansas won't legalize, but maybe Illinois, right? When they legalize marijuana, they will use Oregon-made products and Oregon companies to help them expand and grow their businesses. We're not there yet. It's only been a couple years, but we have it there with the alcohol cluster, and our hopes are that we can develop a marijuana cluster along the same lines. And with that, I'm over my time. Thank you so much. Here's my contact information. I'm always happy to chat. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do I go right there now?
Nailed it, yes.
Yeah.
All right, so we are about to do something that I always think is a dangerous thing to do in a presentation. I'm going to ask you all to pull out your cell phones. Remember how I said that when we had the cell phone, the vision is always zoomed in just perfectly and we missed the big picture of the map? Well, we're actually going to try to get some big picture concepts from you all. So this is an opportunity for you as the audience to participate. We're going to do some live polling. So really quickly, if we can get as fast as you can, open your cell phones, open your web browsers, and go to menti.com. Maybe we can get that on the board there. Yeah, so go to the top there. You see Menti, MENTI.com. And there's going to be a code that you're going to need to put in, and there's some numbers there, 871005. I feel like the lotto guy, right? What's the next number that just came through? So get there really quickly. Now, the interesting thing is with economic indicators, we have sort of different types, right? We have what are called lagging indicators, which include things like employment numbers, right? And those are something that tell us about the past. We also have things that are leading indicators, things like job ads or housing permits that can tell us something about the future. So in this case, we're hoping that you guys will be a leading indicator for us and will tell us a little bit about your perspective on where you're going to be and where you're going in the future. So once you get there, the first question that we have for you guys, there's two questions associated with this, is how do you feel about, first, your personal financial situation today? How are you feeling today about things that are going on in your life and your household? The second question is more generally, how do you feel about the upcoming year? Still associated with your personal financial situation. Do you feel better or worse than you do right now? And these two dots are going to sort of move around as you keep doing responses. We have 50, 60, some people already responded. Holy cow, you guys are good. Woo! It's shocking. It's just hovering in that middle zone there. What do you got? I was thinking we'd start to see some disparity between these two, but everyone's staying pretty consistent. Any thoughts there so far? We already got 170 people on there. So it seems like a slight trend right now. Number 2, right, is the future, how you guys are feeling about the next year. It's just subtly less optimistic, a little bit less of risk takers in the future, but really similar. I think this is a bit shocking to me. What do you guys think?
I'm afraid we influenced it a little too much by saying we're slowing down, right? But I think this would be, I would assume this is relative. We're at a high vantage point, right?
Yeah.
So where things are right now are pretty good, and we're expected to maintain something like that. If you would go relative to 5-10 years ago, then we'd see much more optimism. That'd just be my
Totally.
guess.
It's pretty fascinating. So we're all in that upper right-hand quadrant, though. So that's like, we're towards risk-taking and more optimistic, and we still feel that way, kind of, mostly, for next year. So the next question that's going to pop up, it should automatically switch on your screen, so you shouldn't have to do much. Is your organization, the organization that you work for, planning to hire in the next year? And we're talking about new positions, not replacements. So not someone retired and we have to backfill their position, but are you adding new people additionally onto your payroll next year? Man, you're fast. I was always cautious about polls that they take too long, but we've already got 292 people who have responded. All right, we've got hiring still anticipated happening. So right now, as Josh had pointed out, we're sitting right now with rates of hiring about 4.5% in Deschutes County. It's quite a bit slower in the rural counties right now, but for some context there, we've seen about 4,500 new jobs added in Deschutes County in the last 12 months. And based on these responses, it sounds like we're still expecting a lot of organizations to anticipate growing, not just replacing positions.
Yeah, that's great. Almost a 2-to-1 margin. People continuing to expand, chase those market share and the profits and all that. That's great to hear.
I'll go to the next one because you guys are so fast at this. So do you anticipate having any difficulties filling job vacancies in the next year? Now, these could be either your replacements or your new hires. So in any opening that you might have, do you anticipate any issues? Whoa! Oh, that's kind of fun. This graphic doesn't look really as fun when you've got 2 people doing it, but when you've got 300 people doing it, whoa. So let's get, clearly some challenges. And these are some of the challenges that were alluded to in the presentations, right? When we get to the mature part of the business cycle, we have lots and lots of issues. We have a lot of folks that are left in the labor pool that are unemployed, have barriers to employment, and so you got to find some issues with them. So let's get some better understanding of maybe why you're having difficulties. So if you said yes, please submit a short comment describing those anticipated difficulties. These got to come up quickly, so hopefully I can read some of them. We can catch them as they're coming. Labor shortage, skills, limited talent pool, labor shortage, skilled labor issues, cost of homes, housing, skills, etc. You might be able to scroll down on that business. I can't do that, though. So these are all comments that we would expect to see at this point in the business cycle, right? I mean, everything that we're seeing here.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you're at a point where those that are skilled, that have those backgrounds, are employed in those positions. And so as you try to expand that out, you don't necessarily have the in-migration of people matching up with the skill needs for the area.
Totally. I saw lazy on there. Jeez Louise, come on. But remember, it's always important to remember that the people that are unemployed today that you're finding difficulties with aren't a reflection of the labor pool in general, right? The best and brightest are employed already, so you're finding these folks that are sort of have barriers to employment. So the whole labor force isn't lazy. Maybe you've just found some of those unemployed people might be a little lazy. But all right, we got a couple more questions. We'll start with the sad one first, okay? What is one word to describe what you are nervous or anxious about in the following year? So you only get one word, no sentences. We're going to get this fancy word bubbly thing going on here. We kind of thought Trump might show up there. That was an anticipated danger. A happy face. Whoa. Yikes. Some consistency. Recession, I see, is on there. There's some concerns that maybe the next year there might be a recession. Rate hikes, politics in general, husband losing his job. I don't know how you got 2 words, more than 1 word in there. I thought I limited this one. Gosh, there's Trump, too, which, Tom brought this up a little bit, that recessions don't die of old age, right? They die either because of, what did you call it, bad behavior from either
Yes.
the policy side or the business side. So maybe people are seeing that maybe more on the policy side, some fears.
Yeah, I'm not surprised what's in the middle.
Yeah. We're all public employees, so we just bite our tongue right now. We just can't say anything. So we'll go. Those are the things you're anxious about. We'll look at the more fun one here. So could you please describe with one word what you're excited about in the next year? What are the things that you most anticipate? And once again, try not to do sentences. I don't know how that works with a word bubble, but someone got it in there. Growth, opportunity, powder. Yeah, ski season. There we go. Who cares about the economy? We just care about how much snow falls this winter. Hey, Trump shows up again. There we go. So, opportunity, growth, weather. Well, those are the transplants that said weather. They're like, you'll get tired of the sun. Believe me. I grew up in Portland, and then I lived in Spokane for quite a while. And that transition to sort of the high desert is like really hard at first. You're like, are we in a drought? We got to be in a drought. It's not raining enough. And then you move to Central Oregon from someplace that's like dry, and you think it even worse. So the anxiety will kick in for you Portland transplants. We're not in a drought. We're okay. Well, maybe we're a little bit in a drought. All right. Anything to say here, guys?
I think it's interesting. It makes sense from how we think about our lives. The downside risks are all financial and economic, right? We're worried about our situation, our husband losing the job, growth will slow, our business sales will fall, that sort of thing. But on the personal side, it's what do we do in our fun time, right? Family, recreation, the powder comment in there, right? You know, it's kind of the dichotomy. We're excited about all the stuff we do outside of the office, and we're worried about the stuff inside.
Yeah, totally. All right. Well, thank you for participating with that. We are going to open it up so that now you guys can dialogue with us. So I think we got some good leading indicators from you all. You're pretty optimistic. We're feeling good that next year's going to be somewhat similar than this year. Maybe a bit of a retread, which is not a bad thing. 2018 has been a phenomenal year for us here in Central Oregon. But now we're going to open up for question and answers. So we've got roaming mics if anyone out there wants to ask a question of anyone up here. I might even chime in, but I think you want to hear from the bigwigs here. Any questions? Katie's got the mic.
Hello? I'll ask the first question.
Yes.
So, the labor market and how difficult it is to fill positions here. In Central Oregon, we're shaking it off at a long-term view of poverty with a view. So when you're thinking about wages, do you see any trends changing in Central Oregon in that regard as far as wages are concerned?
The question was the poverty, getting away from the poverty with a view and wage growth. Is that correct, Katie?
Correct.
I think so. I think something to point out is we are seeing shifts within the labor market and the types of jobs being created. Broadly speaking, the number one category for job growth this cycle in Deschutes County, at least, is high-wage jobs. These are mostly office-type work, mostly require a college degree. They pay, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 and above for the typical worker. Those have outpaced them, but second place behind them would be the low-wage jobs. And so with the large tourism sector here and all this stuff that relies upon the travel industry, those are a lot of low-wage jobs, and you don't want to get rid of those either. So I think that compositional shift is maybe masking some things underneath the surface because we have a lot of good high-wage job growth. At the same time, we're getting a lot of low-wage growth, and tourism is basically at an all-time high as long as the smoke stays away.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you have, especially with the housing affordability situation, the tough part is if that really starts to weigh on people's decisions to come here, I think it can have an aspect of slowing down in migration into this area. And then where do the people live that are on the relatively lower wage jobs in the leisure and hospitality industry if they can't be close to where these things are located? Where is that housing going to come from? And thus, if they can't find it, if it's unaffordable, they may actually leave the area.
In this expansion, we've had a relatively dramatic change in the composition of our industries. And dramatic is sort of a word that maybe is a bit over the top because we tend to think of needing to say, the shift in employment in industry has to move to I got to take over market share by 10% or something. We're not saying anything like that. But for other metropolitan areas, the shift that we've seen in the professionalization of Central Oregon's economy, moving away from sort of natural resources to some extent, but really the market share that tourism holds up has been relatively fixed, actually shrunk a little bit in the last couple of years. So we are becoming much more metropolitan. We look much more like your traditional metro area as far as the composition of the jobs that we have here, obviously with the slightly higher leisure and hospitality industry. But even in context there, like our leisure and hospitality industry looks similar to someplace like Denver, for instance. So like it's not that much off as far as the share of our total employment. We've recently looked into wages a little bit more deeply because the wage conversation came up. One of the questions that we often hear at the statewide level is people ask, well, is the wage gains coming from new hires? Is it just high-paying new jobs that are driving up the wages? Or are people who are continuously employed, most of us in this room, are we all collectively seeing wage gains with our incumbent, the business we work for? And so we try to disaggregate this a little bit to better understand what's going on and how people or who's driving the wages up. And it's really phenomenal to see that we have seen phenomenal wage growth for the incumbent workforce. So individuals, because of the tight labor supply, businesses are in tune with that. And in order to sort of keep their skilled labor from leaving and jumping ship to another business, they're offering higher wages at a really rapid pace right now. So we do know for a fact that the wage gains are coming, yes, from new hires and from new high-paying industries, but we're also seeing the tightness of the labor supply mean that all of us collectively are also doing a little bit better today as well.
Great. I have another question for you.
What do you see are the obstacles to housing starts?
Obstacles to housing starts.
Well, one, as I mentioned before, one of the obstacles is the really higher costs of constructing homes right now, be it from property to materials to workers. And it's tougher to get that sort of a price point where for people to find to their first step into the housing market and being able to get that starter home. Those are in very small supply right now. And for better or for worse, you have to balance things out. There's reasons why we have urban growth boundaries. And part of the reason is that we don't want to be Houston. We don't want to be Dallas. We don't want to be Phoenix. And have that huge spread of homes that are around there. At the same time, it tends to make housing prices a bit higher. It tends to limit the supply of homes. And so, you like the small area, and you like that small community feeling and so on. At the same time, there's downsides to it in terms of housing supply, and thus higher rents and higher house prices. So I don't know what exactly you do to that. Do you change density requirements, possibly allowing other neighborhoods changing zoning? It's never really popular among single-family households. I don't know to what extent you are looking into ADUs, accessory dwelling units. They're starting to gain quite a bit of importance in the Portland area. And then there is governmental policy. Do you start to have some of your budget going towards providing affordable housing, low-income housing for some of your residents? It's a cost that for example, in the Portland area, the metro government is trying to float a bond and getting voter approval of it, and it means a little higher property taxes. So if you have a crisis, unfortunately, you have to pay more money to fight it.
The only other thing I would add to that is we're seeing, so this underbuilding, this new home construction, is a nationwide phenomenon or problem, at least in the places that are growing again. Boise's numbers are up. Boise and Austin always lead the nation in new home construction, and they haven't built enough housing, right? So it's not an Oregon-specific issue. It's an Oregon challenge, but it's a nationwide issue. And so some of the other things you can look into is lending from financial institutions. The volume of loans across the U.S. going to single-family developers is still 60% less than it was a decade ago. That's not adjusted for inflation. The overall volume of credit from FDIC insured, and so that's forced developers to go outside of the traditional banking industry to find credit, and they're using hedge funds and private equity and friends and all like these high net worth people throwing money into them on a project by project basis. And so the financial system behind the home building industry has been mucked up and shows no real signs of correcting yet. We know the banks turned on the spigots, the credit spigots for apartments. We saw a surge of apartments in all the metro areas. We've seen apartments here. We've seen apartments, they even built one apartment in Medford, right? And so we're starting to get that across the state. But now they're turning that off as they're worried about overbuilding the multifamily market. And we're waiting for them to turn it on the single family side. And as of yet, nationwide, the answer is no. So that's a big challenge.
Yeah, and the labor tightness has been addressed, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse there with that one. But I think one thing that isn't addressed enough is the fact that we had a significantly larger number of builders, developers, like the companies themselves that did this work back in the last expansion. We had a 75% drop, so 75% of our builders went out of business in the last recession here in Central Oregon. We have hardly any new business growth in that side. So the handful of businesses that survived the recession, we know who they are, right? The Haynes, the Polishes, et cetera. They're the best out there. They're great at this stuff, but there's not a lot of other people sort of joining in and starting to create these businesses that do this work. So they're busy, their hands are tied, maybe they're at capacity, et cetera. So that's another limit, not just labor, but just the sheer number of businesses that actually do this work, that actually build houses and build units like that has been a major issue for us.
And I would say, as an economist, what I would not recommend are anything like necessarily inclusionary zoning, rent controls. These are market stoppers. They slow down the regular market process of trying to provide that greater supply. So if you do policies, try to think of how can you accentuate market conditions? How can you help the builders, help the people buying homes in a market sense, try to get into housing.
Thank you, gentlemen. Next question.
Hi, so information that I've read has said that business starts are at a 40-year low across the country, and there are a lot of us working on entrepreneurial startups across the state and building an ecosystem for that. So does any of your data show that that's moving the needle in any way on building more economic strength and resiliency in our state?
You're absolutely right. Startup activity is at a historic low since we started getting the data, which is from the 70s, so the 40-year low. It's stabilized since the recession. It hasn't really increased a ton. As a share, right, the overall number of startups is increasing a little bit, but as a share of all firms in the economy, we're at that historic low. And this is across all industries. This isn't, it's across retail, it's across manufacturing, professional business services is down, tech is down. That's the kind of a misnomer. People think high tech's always coming up with new ideas and new businesses. That's true, but they're doing it at a slower pace today than they did 20 years ago. The one bright spot was the last thing I was just talking about, the vice industry, right? The startups we've seen in alcohol in particular are bucking that big economy-wide trend. And unfortunately, we don't have a good answer for why we're seeing the decline. Researchers have thrown out a million different reasons. Maybe it's a demographic issue. Gen X is a relatively smaller demographic, and it's people that are in their 30s and 40s that start the most companies. So as the baby boomers aged into their 50s and 60s, the cohort that was left in their peak entrepreneurial years was smaller. Maybe that was it. Maybe it was health insurance related job lock, where you were scared to branch out onto your own because you'd have to pay for health care. But these things haven't proven to be the case in terms of explaining it. And so the research here is really starting to coalesce around a really dark scenario. Unfortunately, it's about barriers to entry. It's about incumbent firms erecting regulations and getting politicians to enact policies that make it harder for new startups. It's about occupational licensing and all these sort of things that make it harder to start a new business. That's really what's behind the decline in entrepreneurial activity across the country. This is the declines we've seen in Oregon perfectly match the declines we've seen at the U.S. And so it's probably going to be a policy-driven solution. And so incubators and things like that certainly will help. But until we get rid of some of these other barriers to entry in a broader sense, I would expect the entrepreneurial numbers to stay pretty low, unfortunately.
I think from a financial situation, banks and so on, traditional places where maybe entrepreneurs went to, that activity is starting to pick up. But I think there's still a little bit of shyness given the financial collapse that we had back in 2008 and 2009. It's coming around, but to be able to get that starter loan and so on for your business, you've really got to show a better return than I think was probably true in the past. But as I said, that's starting to loosen up.
Thank you, gentlemen. Next question.
So it sounds like the consensus is 2019 is going to be another pretty solid year. So my question is, back in 2006, 2005, there were signs that things were about ready to crack or break. What kind of signals or signs are you looking for in 2019 and beyond that things might be cracking and breaking? And is there any correlation to how much it will crack or break?
Yeah, I usually look at La Nina or El Nino to decide whether or not, snowpack. No. This is for these guys.
Well, back then, you once again, you're looking for bad behavior. And we had just the flipping of homes, speculation. A home wasn't a place to live in. A home was a speculative investment, something that you held on for a couple of months or a year and then flipped it to try to make money. And then you used that money to try to buy more homes. And even the guy that cut my hair was flipping homes. But so what you look for now, I'm looking for, is there some bubble out there? Something that looks like it could burst. Possibly we thought about the stock market. We see now the gyrations that are happening. Though I think the stock market is going through possibly what we might call a healthy somewhat correction. There were sectors that were probably too high. Techs were too high. I think that is not necessarily an asset bubble happening. The home prices, they are starting to settle down. They're not constantly growing like they were in the housing boom before the crash happened. They are correcting and slowing the way they should do. Demand and supply is working the way it is. So I don't see from market aspects an indication of anything to be really scared about, either asset bubble-wise or the housing market and so forth. My worry is the indicators I'm looking at federal policy. And as I said before, I don't think it's a good idea. I like to pay less taxes, don't get me wrong. But, when things are already at full employment and you try to get even faster growth, where do the resources come from to get that faster growth? We're not doing it from in-migration, right, when we're constricting that in terms of labor supply for people. So it may give way. When you squeeze the balloon, instead of the growth end of it growing, I think the inflation end has a better chance to grow. And then you get a classic Federal Reserve correction. And Federal Reserve policy, interest rate changes and so on, that works a long time. It takes a while for it to affect businesses and spending and decision making. And so as they start to raise the interest rates, you may not see the effect for a good 9 to a year into the future. So that's why I think 2019 is still going to be okay. The risk may not happen, but the risk is that inflation can start to creep up farther. I think we're going to see wages starting to go up because now, rather than hiring new labor, your businesses are competing with each other for the same labor, and that means wages start to go up. And workers start to recognize that they can get a better wage just by simply moving across the street, as an example. So that's the bad behavior I'm looking at is really one that's already been set. And now we have to see how the economy reacts to the tariff situation, the tax cut, the increase in federal government spending, and is that going to translate into an inflationary environment?
Thank you. We have a question here in the back. Go ahead.
What has been the impact of outsourcing labor to like China? Now they're the largest growing economy. Most of the manufacturing plants and technology are located there. What's that been our impact?
The local impact is maybe a little bit less than the nation. And there's a famous paper in the economic literature that came out a handful of years ago called The China Shock. comes from some very respected economists that do a ton of great work, and they show that the China shock was real in terms of some of the losses in manufacturing, and it predominantly hit the Rust Belt and the heartland. It hit here in Oregon to a certain degree because we have that larger manufacturing base. Now all of this research shows that the China shock is over and has been for 10 years now. It was really about the late 90s, early 2000s when that dot-com recession hit. We started offshoring a lot more stuff. We did in the 90s and then again in the early 2000s, but since then it's been a relatively stable environment, and we're starting to get, we're no longer worried about Chinese currency manipulation like we were 15 years ago, and the trade balance is relatively steady. Doesn't mean we're in the best situation we're in the world, but it's stabilized in the last 10 years, and so the impact on year-to-year growth is relatively minimal, but doesn't mean it wasn't a real event 15 years ago.
Yeah, I partially agree with that, in that I don't know how you partially agree with someone. But, China still, it depends on what year you look at, in terms of where Oregon exports go to. China's been at one of our times our #1 destination. It's usually in the top 3, So right now, I think the worry is if China's economy is slowing down, and indications are that it is. The yuan has depreciated again, so they're trying to get their exports going again. To the extent that economy slows down, that will have a reverberation to us in terms of slowing down our exports to them. So I think it does have, not as a large impact, I think, but various sectors, I think high tech would be one, agriculture especially. A slower China is going to have a slowdown effect on some of our business sectors.
Absolutely.
Great. Another question from our fabulous Edco here.
Oh, great presentation. Question about labor force. You had labor participation rates kind of across the board for the state and our region. What are they looking at for a segment of population, say our young adults, 16 to 24? What's happening in that for a trend? And is that an opportunity for us to fill some of those jobs with younger adults that maybe haven't been working, say through programs like the Ben Chambers internship program?
Yeah, I'll take this one. Yeah. Labor economist, I got this. Woo! No China questions. Thanks, Roger. So we actually have good stats on demographics of labor force participation rate across the state. We don't have a good idea here locally in Central Oregon. The data is sort of disaggregated enough that we can't make a good statement on it. But during the depths of the recession, we saw labor force participation rate for young workers drop pretty dramatically, and that's sort of this notion that millennials were butt sitters at home in their parents' basements, right, playing Xbox and smoking pot, right? So that's sort of where the stigma came from. But we've seen a dramatic recovery there. What's interesting, though, even during the depths of the recession, there's a term that we call, it's a statistical term called idle youth. Those are the people who are neither in the labor force nor in school. So these are the true butt sitters, right? You're not doing anything. You're just at home. That number actually never really increased that much. So it was sort of a misnomer that this young cohort during the depths of the recession was sort of just doing nothing. There was just no job opportunities available, so they weren't in the labor force. So what were they doing instead? They were at places like COCC or OSU Cascades, or they were going back and retooling and getting education. So that has actually translated into, now we have a new generation of 16 to 24-year-olds who are entering or approaching the labor force in a time when labor demand is super high. It's a pretty awesome opportunity for them, actually. There's been a lot of research that showed that individuals who graduate college or graduate high school in the midst of an expansion have a huge long-term impact on their lifetime earnings by being sort of in that ability to sort of jumpstart their career. The inverse is also true. Those people who start their career in the midst of a recession often have about an 8-year lag behind those people who are in an expansion. So we are seeing the labor force participation rate for young people increasing. And I'd say the biggest reason why we don't see it increase faster than it is we still prioritize higher education. I would argue we should probably be prioritizing higher education and being in the labor force simultaneously. But that's just my perspective.
Yeah.
Great. Shameless plug here for the Chamber's internship placement program. They also have one in Sisters, Prineville, Madras, and Redmond. It's a regional effort to bring those young people into the market. And we, as chambers in Central Oregon, are trying to match those young people up with opportunities within our membership. So if you're interested, contact one of the chambers in your region. Any other questions? Yep, we got one more over here.
Last recession, the home building and real estate industry was certainly hardest hit, may have been the cause. Looking out to 2020, what industries do you see as most at risk?
A couple things. First, housing is unlikely to be hit, certainly not as severe as last time, and probably less severe than is typical for a recession. Given the underproduction that we've seen, there's still going to be housing demand, and given those demographics are baked into the cake. All those millennials that are 20, 25, 28 years old today, they're going to need a place to live when they're 35, right? So the built-in demographics to the cake means housing should be more stable moving forward than it certainly has been in past recessions. Now, the downturn, the cyclical industries are always at risk. The manufacturing, Oregon's going to get hammered in a manufacturing sense, as we always do during a recession. Beyond that, it's a little bit hard to tell. The one risk that's out there, at least as a potential risk, would also be our high tech, or our newer high tech and software. Historical Oregon's strength in high tech has been on the manufacturing side. Tektronix, Intel, things like that, where they're making the physical high tech good. But all the growth in the last decade has been on the software side, and a lot of that software growth we're seeing are outposts. Or satellite offices. They're not homegrown Oregon industries. And so there's the risk that during a recession, they cut the spokes and consolidate at the hub and will reconvene back in California and collapse operations and rejigger moving forward after that. That's a risk. It's not necessarily going to happen, and particularly to the extent that we're a low-cost alternative. We're probably always going to be a low-cost alternative to California. And so if that's the reason we're up here, then maybe that spoke-hub relationship's different than it has been in the past. But I think that's a risk for something that's been a good driver of Oregon's economy for a couple decades now.
Yeah, and I would say that now for not a whole lot of years, but I'd say at least the last 5 years, definitely, retail has been trying to reinvent itself. And, you know, we hear about Sears going bankrupt. I still don't know why JCPenney's is still open, really. You know, so these brick and mortar are changing. And you're having, you know, people like Amazon, other internet type of retailers, which are almost somewhat getting themselves vertically integrated, at least on the level of wholesale to retail. And almost there's a blurred vision between the two anymore. And so I think the retail area is one that you start to hit a recession. They're already against some of the big box brick and mortar type places are against the wall already. You have a downturn, it could even hurt them more. And they, I think, are more vulnerable during a recession.
Okay, I think it's about time to wrap up. I have a question for you guys before we go. Don't you call yourselves members of the dark arts? Isn't that what an economist is? Isn't that what you call it? Perfect for Halloween.
We're Gryffindors. We're good.
Here's my takeaway of the morning. Economists are funny, aren't they? They're very funny. They're funny people.
Look what we have to deal with.
I want to thank all of you. Can we give them one last round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so one last thanks to all of our sponsors, Bryant Loveland Jarvis, PacificSource, and all of our sponsors for bringing this to you today. And here's the special takeaway prize. So in the middle of your table are squashes and a lot of candy. So if you don't fight, you can decide amongst yourselves which one of you get to take those pumpkins home, and the rest of you can have the candy. So I wish you all a happy Halloween, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. Have a good day.